Hello, I'm Robert, and this time we're going to talk about how we can feed everyone through to 2100 and beyond on all scenarios. So, and you so often hear people saying, oh, we're not going to be able to feed everyone, we're all going to die, or billions going to die. But that's not what the scientists are saying. And this is from the IPBES report from earlier this year, 2019. And this is the chapter 4, and one of the lead authors for chapter 4 is this Almut Arneth, professor in Germany. And you can listen to her say it. And she says that we're going to explore how the world will look in 2050, 2100, and where we have a more sustainable future, then much better outcome in terms of providing food, feed and fibre to everyone. At the same time, with increasing provision of ecosystem services and reducing the destruction of nature. So we can do that if we choose to operate and have a more sustainable system. And then, but then she was asked, in the question and answer, can we feed everyone through to 2050? And so I'll just play this a little bit.
Dr. Diaz or someone paint a picture of what 2050 will look like for humans, i.e. food, water, energy, and in general, if little is done.
Thank you very much. Will Dr. Diaz take that question? In a moment. We'll come back in a moment. And we'll have the second question, please.
The question is from a gentleman at the...
Food for all and biodiversity. For more precise numbers, I would again invite our coordinating lead author, Almut Arneth.
Well, you challenged me quite a lot about numbers. I think I'm going to chicken out of the numbers. But I think the question is, what will the world look like in 2050? It is our choice. It is purely our choice. None of the scenarios we've been exploring would indicate that we cannot feed the world or cannot provide water, cannot provide shelter. That's for sure. But we can do it in a sustainable way, or we can do it in an unsustainable way. And that is really our choice.
So that's it. So none of them mean that we can't have food, water or shelter. We can do it in a sustainable way, or we can do it in an unsustainable way. And it's the same also for if you look at the IPCC, and they did their worst case scenario, and this is going through to 2100 this time, and the actual report goes through to 2100, but she was answering on 2050 because that's what they're asking. But it's the same thing. So we can still feed everyone through, but we can do it with an unsustainable or an unsustainable way. And this is a worst case where the Paris Agreement falls apart, which didn't actually happen. But they did that in 2018. And too little was done too late, little done to adapt and prepare either before 2030 and after that fragmented and uncoordinated efforts. And so then, with the droughts and stress on water resources, renders agriculture economically unviable in some regions and contributes to increases in poverty. That's by 2100 in their worst case, where we do everything too late. It's not believable that we go all the way up to 4.9 degrees C without doing anything. People would start noticing more and more, and they'll so in their worst case scenario by 2030, and people are really acting quite a lot. They've just started noticing in 2030. It's based on the idea of where we just didn't. This was before all the activists and before the youth movement, and it was still kind of possible in 2018. And people just wouldn't notice what was going on, that the worst things happen in other countries, in places far away from the decision makers and in deserts and places. And so in this scenario, then we don't do anything until 2030, and then after that it's all very uncoordinated and too late, and we just scrape in at below 3 degrees centigrade by 2100. At the moment, we're on a 2.9 degrees C path according to Carbon Action Tracker, and we have lots of leeway by increasing our pledges, we can get much less than 2.9 degrees C. And surely, if by the 2030s, 2040s, we'll be going significantly less, at least to, I find it hard to imagine we won't go down to zero emissions by 2070, which would be 2 degrees C, and probably significantly less, and there's several countries already aiming for zero emissions by 2050. I'm in the UK and we're one of them. And that would be the 1.5 C, or at least well below 2 degrees C, a compatible path. But it's supposed to be, it's worst case scenario, and like several small island states give up hope of survival, and increasingly fragmented global community, economic damage is substantial, and general health and well-being of people is substantially reduced compared to conditions in 2020, and continues to worsen over the following decades. It's going backwards on where we've been. So the background to that is we've actually gone forwards considerably since when I was a child, when I was a young adult in the 1960s and 70s. We've had huge advances and increases of life expectancy by 10 years in the industrial parts of the world and 20 years in the least developed countries of increases. Reduced child mortality. We've had many improvements, increased well-being, increased food security. The world has improved tremendously since about the 60s and 70s, but we would risk going back to even substantially reduced compared to what we are now, and instead of making progress, continue to make progress is entirely possible. We could have a world with zero hunger and everyone access to health, and we've got improved education, so the risk is of going in the opposite direction. So how is it we're going to do it? Why is it they say this? Well, first of all, we do have a lot of leeway. This is an idea of how much of the world is used for actual cropland there. This is how much the built-up area, forests, and this is the amount that's used for keeping livestock. And we can actually we can actually do it. We actually do it an awful lot. We can do it actually by just improving the efficiency of the cropland. An awful lot of it in sub-Saharan Africa, of the least efficient cropland. If we can manage to reduce the amount of meat that we eat in the world as a whole, then that can save large areas as well, or use less grain-intensive meat as well, because we're growing an awful lot of crops to feed to these are crops that are grown directly for humans, but we have an awful lot of crops, and says not for animal feed. If you expand it and zoom in, crop minus land for animal feed. So this is just the crops that are not grown for animals, and there's a lot of crops being grown for animals. And if we fed those to humans instead, they use far less land. In fact, the US plus Brazil alone together, they produce enough. If their crops that they grow for animals could feed, I think it was a couple of billion extra people, something like that. Quite a lot of people can be fed just from the grains being used to feed to animals. And so we have lots of leeway. So, we could cut down the forests, so large areas of forests, and if we turn them into cropland, then, so that's what they were talking about there, about how you can diminish the biodiversity in the world. You'll cut down lots of forests and grow crops there instead. But we're not going to have to do that. And there's a couple of urban myths here. It's not a world without insects. That's just, I'm going to talk about that separately. I'm not going to run out of topsoil. I'm going to run out of oxygen. I can talk about those separately if you've got any questions about all that. But we reverse desertification. So we don't need to be stuck with this like this. There's a certain amount, that is all desert. Quite a bit of that can be reversed and turned back into agricultural land. They're doing an awful lot of that in China. And here's an example. That is a real project, 1995, 2009. And this, of course, is also taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And I've got lots of videos here about people reversing desertification. All around the world they're doing it. It's only in Africa and South America that we're still losing forests. And even, I don't think I've got it here, but even in Brazil, yeah, let's see if I can bring that up quickly. It's rather, I'll bring it up while I'm talking. There's a rather optimistic recent scenario coming in Brazil. See if I can come down for a bit. And where is it? Brazil. It's not going to be Brazil. Yeah, there we are. This one. Right. So there's a study did of Brazil where they looked at, so you can find it. And well, that's about how if you cut the forests in Brazil and then they grow again, then the young forests actually take up much more carbon dioxide than the tropical rainforest does as it's growing. But it takes a long time, it takes a long time for it to go back all the way to the amount of carbon dioxide that's sequestered in the tropical rainforest originally. But as the agriculture improves, and this is a projection of land use, and if this is a model looking at how the agriculture is improving, there's a great opportunity to it's very inefficient agriculture, nothing like as efficient as it is in the US. Particularly for instance, the meat production, if they increase from 1 to 1.7 heads per hectare by 2005, and it's over 2 in the US. So with a big push on that, they could do much better than that. It involves things like reseeding the grassland when it's worn out, which it's hard for the poor people in Brazil who don't have a lot of capital. It's hard for them to do that. It's quite expensive. But you wouldn't even think twice about doing that in the US. So they did this model with crop yields including 1.5% GP yield and meat production linear increase to 1.7 heads, and food take growing and meat products growing, and then they found that you start getting a lot of freed agricultural land because of increasing yields. And by 2050, you've got large areas of land that has been freed in Brazil. So this is a middle of the range, middle of the road model for Brazil, integrated model, and they then looked at different ways of using the freed up land. And they found that the agricultural land, the amount of land that you need for it, peaks by 2020 and then liberates land at a rate of 6% annually. And the forest land is reduced, natural forest is reduced most of that in the first 15 years. And so by 2035, then natural forest land, 2010 that is, so by 2025, then the natural forest land will have reached its minimum, will have more or less stopped. Not quite its minimum, but it will have more or less stopped by 2025, according to this scenario. And then they found that with reforestation, then the total stock of carbons, the reforestation would be able to recover, because there's more freed land than there was cut kind of recently. By 2035, there was a large area reforested and was deforested, but by then by 2025, there's a total, the carbon change. That's the reference, carbon change. This is the sugarcane, and this is the reforestation. And you see the carbon change is going up after this point, because so if they were to take all the abandoned land and they were to reforest it, then you could be back to above 2010 levels of the sequestered carbon by 2050. So that can happen. That could happen. That can happen in Brazil as well. It's a possible future. All the forests burning and so on and cutting down, then with this middle of the road, and you could do better than this, because they're not very not very ambitious targets really. If they were to really head out and say we're going to do this really efficiently, then you could do better than that. So that's deforestation is going on still in South America and Africa, and that can be turned around. And in other parts of the world, it's already happening. China is massively reforesting, and it's a few percent points already gone up. And I have to look up the figures, but it's going. You could see from here what sort of thing is going on in China, and it's happening in other places around the world as well. And there's a whole video. I've put a list of some of my others. What would you say is the most deforested? Now, where have I got that? What would you say if you haven't? Well, you may have seen the thing I shared, but if not, what would you say would be one of the worst deforested areas in Northern Europe? But it happened over 1,000 years, and the answer is that's the wrong link. I'll have to change that. Oh yes, it's the end of that. Oh yes, no, it's at the end of that. I've also got now. That's what I was actually looking at, the very same one. So there we are. So that's growing. That's actually tiny forest. That's not grass. Those little trees. And this is in Iceland. Just Greenland. I meant Iceland. And the Iceland is the most deforested country. And it's been pretty much denuded of forests, just through people cutting things down and a few sheep over 1,000 years, and a few animals. And they're growing forests again in Iceland. And lots of other forestry things going on. All around the world we have these reforesting projects going on. And if you want a little bit of cheering up, then I recommend having a look at some of these videos of reforesting projects. And that'll maybe help you feel a little bit happier about the world, and not we get so much gloom and doom and being sent by journalists. It sells, and it's kind of, people buy your stories if you say everything's bad. And this is saltwater greenhouses. This was before and after. This is just seawater, and then it comes up into these greenhouses, and then it just evaporates in the sunlight and produces this moisture. Not even a desalination plant, just seawater coming in, and then they get salt as a product. And so there's all this wonderful stuff going on. And then yes, that's again about the whole thing about how we've got plenty of food if we were to ration meat. So that is the worst case in the future, is global meat rationing. That would be the very worst case, because we could then have a huge margin of food. It's not going to be necessary, but just to help you be a bit relaxed about it. Like in when we had to feed everyone in the UK in World War II, we had to use meat rationing, because you can produce more food if you eat it directly as crops rather than if you eat it as meat. Feed it to the animals and then you eat the animals. So that's the worst case. But it's not likely that we need to do that. And so if you look at it, and what's this looking at? This place is really map shows where yields can improve. It's a map where yields can improve. Can I bring it up? And we find Southern Africa. I just have to wait how to get to it. One of these, I don't like these. You've got to keep scrolling down and down and down, and it keeps getting stuck until you get to the map. Where's the map? There's the map where yields could improve. So there you are. Look at this. I think if you click on the plus, you can get it. So massive opportunity for improvements in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's the problem is, and if we look back here, this is the Green Revolution, which people don't really realise, but in the 1950s and 60s, then the crops hugely increased. See the increased yields in developed countries, Asia especially. We wouldn't be able to feed everyone in China if we had the 1960s crops, 1960s varieties, and 1960s levels of agriculture. And half the world population just would have died if we kept going with the growing population and we'd had those yields. So there's a massive change in the productivity of agriculture. And this is continually happening, and it's happening all around the world, developed countries, Latin America, but Africa, if you notice, has hardly changed. That's because the scientists just haven't been focusing so much on Africa, and they've just continued along with their old traditional methods with some small changes. They haven't had the huge increases in improved varieties, especially things that grow particularly in Africa and the conditions there. So we can make a huge difference, and part of the thing is that an awful lot of the increase is going to happen in Africa, and that is just going up to the 1990s. Been more increases since then, and if you look at the crop yields, those are the crop yields for China. This is a log scale, so that's a tenfold increase from there to, say, Niger to New Zealand or something. Niger, or we can see if we can read that, Zimbabwe to New Zealand, or even to China. So much more than that's a tenfold increase, 10 times more crops from the same area. And so there's obviously huge room for improvement here, even if they don't manage tenfold. They certainly manage multiples of the crop yields, just by applying the same techniques that over most of the world has already been done. And so that's the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, is to apply this Green Revolution to Africa. And so luckily, sub-Saharan Africa, if you look at the population, I've got a population that's further. Oh, and another huge thing we can do is we can deal with waste. Where's the waste? So yes, here's an example of a pilot study that managed to have losses of 32% in the crops just because they didn't have refrigerated trucks. Look at these without the cold chain, with the cold chain. Massive improvements. So, and this is how much food waste in kilograms per year. This is lost at so if you look at the Northern Europe, an awful lot is lost at the consumer end. And if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, then there's very little lost to consumers. Consumers just don't waste much food. It's all being lost in the crops and delivery to the market, and these problems with refrigerated lorries and grain going bad and things like that. So you can make a huge difference. And then every year, consumers in rich countries, the waste, just the waste, not the production, waste almost as much food as the entire net food production of sub-Saharan Africa. Entire sub-Saharan Africa, all that food, we waste. Just as wasting food. Just like, when things go mouldy in your fridge, or the supermarket doesn't quite cater correctly and it's got some leftover food. So it's clear we can make a huge difference by saving on food. And we can make an enormous difference also. So that's why and this becomes more and more clear as the scientists work on this, that from recent papers, that reducing food waste is a huge element of doing something about this. Another enormous thing that makes a big difference is to change agricultural subsidies. So we have these very high, we have subsidies, can't remember the figure, or should have looked up the figure. We've got the large subsidies, we have subsidies for fossil fuel, so like fossil fuels are lower cost than they would be because they're subsidised, and especially the fossil fuels used for power stations. And it should be the other way around. And then as well, we have subsidies for destructive forms of agriculture which cut down forests and stuff. And we should have subsidies the other way around, where we subsidise sustainable agriculture, and there's a certain amount of that, but there isn't nearly as much as there is of the subsidies in the other direction. And the IPBES report in earlier this year, they said that these two things, dealing with food waste and dealing with these subsidies for damaging biodiversity, these are the main things that are causing extinctions. When they say we're in the middle of a mass extinction, and we're not really, we're just at the start of one that would take 1,000 years to unfold. But too many species are going extinct. And this is the best way to deal with it. So the risk is not of people being unable to have food, but there is a risk of severely damaging the ecosystems which we depend on in various ways. So the nature services. It doesn't mean again that we're going to die of that, but we're going to leave the next generation and the generation after that, like our grandchildren, with a severely depleted world, with lots of forests gone and lots of natural systems not working quite as they should, and then they would have to do the recovery. We need to do the recovery now. So stop this and reverse it. So that's what they're talking about. They said do it now rather than leave it to our great-grandchildren or grandchildren in a depleted world where a lot of species have gone extinct. So that's what this is all about. And the warming of the planet leading to people, it's not going to be a world which is more uninhabitable. It's actually going to be more habitable in some ways, but people having to move by the hundreds of millions and change the way they do agriculture, or else do a lot of very expensive adapting and stay where they are. That's what it's all about. And there's no way that like a young child in the UK is not going to be. I went into this in my recent talk, but I'm in the UK, and there's Extinction Rebellion people going around telling children here that we don't have a future, and saying that we won't be able to grow enough food in the UK. If we did like we did in World War II, the same thing applies today. We've got a somewhat larger population, we've got much more efficient agriculture. We could feed everyone without any imports in the UK if we reconfigured our agriculture. The main question is the experts sort of ask, would we need to ration meat or not, like we had to in World War II? And Simon Fairley thinks we wouldn't have to. But we do it very inefficiently. We export vast amounts of milk, and we grow grain to go to the cows, which then produce much more milk than they used to. It used to be that our cows ate grass, but now an awful lot of them eat grain in order to produce more milk, so we can export lots of it, and stuff like that we do. So that's the. So yes, we can do an awful lot of saving of food waste, and if we can save meat waste, so that's just as good. People talk about how you could have one meat-free day a week if you're someone who eats meat with every meal, and that would be a big impact on saving, especially if it's grain-intense meat. It's not the same if it's grass-fed meat. It's worse is if it's grain, and especially if it's cows. Then that's the one that uses most of food that could actually be fed to humans. And we actually waste 20% of the meat. So you can have the same amount of a saving of eating, just having one meat-free day a week, if we could stop all meat food waste. That would be a huge, huge effect. So although we waste lot more of the agricultural waste, it's much higher percentage, but because of that multiplier effect, the much smaller amount of meat that we waste has much more effect on the world as a whole. So the message doesn't seem to have got out to people yet very much. We know about the importance of recycling. Not many people know about the importance of reducing food waste. But the scientists say it's one of the biggest things you can do in your personal life, and that supermarkets can do, and restaurants can do, and so on. And eat less meat and dairy products if or less intensive meat. Anyway, I've got a separate thing about the personal thing, which I'll do as a separate video. So we can definitely feed everyone. And with the improving crop yields, and we could do it, and the population, this is the growth of the population, and this is why they say it's going to level off. You look at these projections, you think, how can they know that? Well, it's because the number of children younger than 15 has already levelled off. If our life expectancy wasn't increasing every single year, then our population would have levelled off by now. The population is only increasing so rapidly because of the medicine and because of the improvements in health and the improvements in well-being around the world, meaning that people are living much longer. And so the projected population there, this is much longer lived people on average. And so with the same number of children, but then the people getting older and older as the time goes on, more and more older people by then. And we're pretty much at peak child. This shows how the life expectancy has increased from there to there. Look, especially, look, 30 life expectancy there was under 30, and lots of sub-Saharan Africa under 40 in 1965, when I was a child. It's now gone up to, large areas are going to in the 50s, 60s, and still it's a lot less than still the life expectancy is a lot less than it could be. There's an awful lot of child mortality there still, but it's going down hugely all the time. And life expectancy going up everywhere in the world. And so this is the projections according to the continents. You can see Asia going like that. Europe is pretty much levelled off already. Northern America increasing slightly but levelling off. Asia peaking and going down. And it's just Africa that is kind of going like that and then going to level off. And it's because of the decreasing of everything else, the whole population is levelling off. But this is quite hard to believe that this actually would happen like that. And look, there it is by region. You can see how it goes by region. Reduction in Asia is a compensation thing for the increase in Africa. Because remember, Africa is really lagging behind in many ways. But this is looking at sub-Saharan Africa, and these are different projections. So this is I'm not sure which one. I didn't do all of them, but the world population one is almost like this one. The African world, it's not quite that. It's between those, and but this is the effect of increasing the amount of tertiary education, like college and or university. This is primary. If you increase the amount of people who get up to that level, then that makes a big difference to the population. And it goes down much quicker. Because the higher your level of education, then the more that you're likely to have fewer children, and what children you have, then you invest a lot more in them, and you have more confidence that your children are going to grow to adulthood. And then, so especially also education of women, so they then have they're much better able to make informed choices and be able to direct their lives if they get to higher education. So that's the key, and reducing child mortality and in better health for children, because they have lots of children, because unlike in the developed country where you can pretty much guarantee you would get a pension when you retire or whatever, then if you're living in sub-Saharan Africa, you're dependent on your children to just be able to continue as an old person, because they'll be the ones who go out in the field growing the crops and getting the food for you. So it's quite important for them to make sure they have at least some healthy children, and so it's no wonder they have big families when the risk of the children, many of them are going to be unhealthy, and many of them die young. So it's very important to improve the health of the young children, and that of course it's necessary for humanitarian reasons, and it makes a big difference to the population projections, and things are actually looking quite good. And then I just want to end with this bit, so people look at this idea that we feed so many, and I said we can always do the rationing, like that's the war, and there's the rations and the meat. That's the worst case, is some kind of worldwide rationing of meat. But I just want to end by saying that even 20 billion people wouldn't be a hard limit. I mean, not anything like that. Even 100 billion. So there are always, these are, and in a sustainable way, without impacting on biodiversity either. So we have these ideas like modern LEDs and these vertical farming and so on. Now this, when you go to space, I'm very interested in space colonization and space settlement and just humans in space. And if you use space technology, they are already way ahead of what we can do in agriculture, in ordinary conventional agriculture. This is an experiment that the Russians did back in the 1960s to 1970s, and they grew short crops that grow very quickly to adulthood: wheat, sedgenut, beet, carrots and other plants, total of 10 crops. And so it's the vegan diet, and then with a little bit of meat, or whatever, a little bit of whatever you might bring in as luxuries, but this is meant to be a space colony, so there's very little imports. So this one, they produce nearly all of their food just from 30 square meters per person. 30 square meters, that's much less even than the most efficient agriculture. And we could read, if we used everyone using that system, we could feed hundreds of billions of people from the land we already use for agriculture. So it's things like that seawater greenhouse I showed you, that's getting on, going towards that, but it's not really quite that. They optimize it, they have them in layers, a conveyor belt system where kind of thing, and layers, what they call it, conveyor, yes, conveyor, that's what they used, conveyor system. We have the many different stages of growth at the same time. and then you could just keep harvesting them. And they chose crops that can reach maturity, and even like dwarf wheat can reach maturity in optimal conditions, and you can optimize it in a greenhouse to whatever is needed, lighting if necessary. Then they can reach maturity in 1 month, rather than the many months that you have for normal conventional agriculture. And that's the main way that they managed to increase the crop yields so hugely, which make a very big difference in a space colony, because the size of your greenhouse, it has to be holding the atmosphere against the vacuum. So you only could have small greenhouses in the early space colonies. So that's why it's so important to grow so much from such a tiny area. And this is just 30 square meters, and the height, this is just one layer. If they had multiple layers, they could feed more people, assuming you've got LED lighting from that same area. That's just a single layer. It's not vertical farming. It's just horizontal layer. So if you had the power for it, and then you had lights, and the LED lighting is much less power than the old lights used to have. So it could just be natural sunlight, but supplemented with LED lighting, and it's definitely possible that we could. And then if you could feed it from, if you had floating cities, and this is already happening. They've got these designs. You've got a certain amount of ideas for floating cities. So what we do have is aquaculture in the sea. So we already have fish farms, and by 2020 we expected to have as much fish coming from fish farms as comes from wild caught fish. And that's why people talk about how we can't continue with wild fishing, because there just isn't a sustainable catch to keep on if the population keeps increasing. Well, we're already doing that. We're doing aquaculture instead. And by 2020 we should have equal amounts of each. And the FAO, they predict that this is going to increase more and more, and a greater and greater percentage will be from aquaculture. Some of the aquaculture is fed foods. You've got to think about where the fish meal comes from. It's used to feed them the fish food, and so there's an amount of agriculture needed for that. But fish is much more efficient than animals are, than cows and pigs. I think fish are best of all. It's cold-blooded after all. And there's this a little enthusiast built his, suppose, seasteading things, but there's going to be he's one early Bitcoin millionaires, and used it to make a tiny seasteading, but there are ideas for bigger ones. And so if we use that, we could actually, I reckoned we'd feed 1 trillion or more people, even from a small percentage of the Pacific, if we did that. So none of this is needed, but this is just to show that especially when you consider that our population is levelling off, then we don't have any hard edge. It's completely, we could feed many more people, even from the same land, invincible. And it's just a case of, so when you talk about the improvement of agriculture, tenfold up to China, but it's you can put far more than, you saw that diagram, I expect. We can go far higher than that if we needed to, and we put enough work into it. And that is that. That's me finished. So we don't need to worry about running out of space to feed everyone. Main thing is whether we do it sustainably or non-sustainably. If we do it non-sustainably, then we have more and more areas of biodiverse forest cut down, and other bits of biodiversity damaged. And if we do it sustainably, we get more and more areas of degraded soil and deserts converted back to lush vegetation and agriculture. There are no technological limitations. The choices are entirely social, as Anwar Darnith said. And some people talk about running out of minerals, water and energy. I've actually got a video about when we're going to peak X, and those claims are not true either. So hopefully this helps some of you who've been worrying about whether we'll feed everyone. We can produce enough food for everyone. The questions are entirely social and political as to how we do it, and whether we do it in a way that preserves biodiversity. And you individually can help with this by reducing food waste, and especially of meat, but all kinds of food waste. And if you feel that you can actually eat less meat, 20% less meat, that's also one meat-free meal a day if you're in a meat-eating country, and that is something also that the experts say can make a big difference, and it's all change from grain-fed meat to grass-fed and to more sustainable forms of meat. And there's difference also, like what kind that you have. The cows are the most land intensive, especially so if you've got a grain-fed cow, that's most impact. So that's it. I'll talk another video about the many things you can do to help. I'll leave this link in the description, so you can go and check in the description.